as we prepared for the Filmmaker Symposium, this is a piece that is the value of which is hard to overestimate. Storytelling for this format, like almost every entertainment format, is critical, but pieces of this process are very important for you as new filmmakers to consider. Topic that's valuable for giant screen, the kinds of stories, the pacing, and all of those elements will be discussed on this panel. Storytelling in the Art of the Giant Screen. So this panel is moderated by a really wonderful and I think legendary woman in our industry, Diane Carlson from the Pacific Science Center. She runs a couple of theaters inside her institution and is a board member of GSCA and really actively involved in our committees. And all of us love working with Diane, and I think she's going to add a lot to this, this panel's discussion. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Diane Carlson.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Thanks, Christian. Thank you very, very much. As mentioned, I'm with Pacific Science Center, and I was very honored to be invited to moderate this panel. Obviously, great films with great stories are absolutely critical to all of us in the industry, and especially those of us that have theaters and want to show great product. We heard this on this morning's panel just how important storytelling is for the giant screen. And we heard it not only from people like me and people in the industry, but most importantly, we heard it from our audiences, given the surveys that the GSCA has conducted. Now, this afternoon, we are fortunate to have 3 panelists who have all contributed to what we experience on the giant screen. And they have participated in several roles. They have also all worked in features and with TV production. The other thing is I hope that we can have this be as much of a conversation as possible. So please be thinking of your questions. We'll take questions in the midst of the panel, but also at the end. But I do promise we will be over on time because the program at 6 p.m. says cocktails. So we will be over on time. So I'm glad that'll work for everyone. I know that most people who have been in the industry know all of our panelists, but I will do some brief introductions. There are also bios in the program that have more detail. Now, in alphabetical order, we have Peter Chang. Peter has worked as a director, producer, and cinematographer. His filmmaking career started in college, assisting with feature films. He is a pioneer in the use of 7K 3D motion-controlled time-lapse capture. He started shooting 3D time-lapse in early 2011. He released a 3D reel online and it went viral. His 3D time-lapse has been seen in Jerusalem 3D and National Park Adventure 3D. He currently is in production for a giant screen film on Cuba that will be released in 2017. He also has extensive work in television, and his work was featured in the music video for Coldplay's Midnight. Peter is based in San Francisco, and his firm is Golden Gate 3D, and like me, he is a UC Berkeley grad. Steve Judson on the far end is president of film production, vice president of film production, I was going to give you a promotion there, and post-production at MacGillivray Freeman Films. For 12 years before working for MacGillivray Freeman, he wrote, directed, and/or edited educational films, low-budget features, and TV documentary shows. 6 of those years were at Universal Studios. He joined MacGillivray Freeman in 1982 and has produced, edited, directed, and written for the giant screen during that time. He used his many talents as producer, writer, and editor for the record-making IMAX film Everest. He was voted into the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences for his work on this film. His newest project is National Parks Adventure 3D. Steve has his editing mark on over 24 of MacGillivray Freeman films. And Wendy MacKeigan is a principal of SK Films. She started her career 30 years ago as an executive in film funding, and then continued in the private sector, mainly working in the feature film arena. She has been in the giant screen film business for over 10 years. She co-wrote the highly successful Flight of the Butterflies 3D. Full disclosure, yes, it was a huge success at our theater. And she is leading the writing team for SK's next film, Amazon Adventure 3D, that is fully funded and currently in production. I am working on this project and can attest firsthand at her passion for the project, or at least for its hero, Henry Bates. She also is currently producing a eco-adventure TV series, The Water Brothers. Now, Stephen Lowe, who is listed as a panelist for our session, could not join us due to his father's death about a week and a half ago. I had the privilege of knowing his dad, Colin, and he was a pioneer in IMAX filmmaking. He contributed greatly to the industry, especially in the area of 3D. His film Transitions premiered in 1986, and it was the first IMAX 3D full-color film. He also co-directed Momentum, the first 48 frames per second IMAX film in 1992. And he was noted for being an excellent storyteller. Now, this afternoon, we're going to have a conversation about storytelling. I will be asking the panelists a series of questions, and there will be ample time for questions from you throughout the program, as I mentioned, as well as the conclusion. The objective of the session is to assist those of you that are new or newer to the giant screen creative process with insights into what makes working in the giant screen format different than other films and what is needed to be successful in marrying the technical strengths of the format with storytelling. All of our panelists have worked in TV, feature films, and non-giant screen documentaries, so they are well equipped to compare and contrast across different formats. Okay, so now on to the fun part. My first question is for Peter. And as the panelist who is newest to the industry, what are the biggest differences that you see in storytelling for the giant screen, different from other formats, and what are the challenges that you have encountered in working on your Cuba project?
Well, first of all, I think giant screen is the image and the visuals are dominant, and it's something that you have to keep in mind at every turn in the storytelling process. Is if you're respecting that, because something that might work on the smaller screen might not be, it might seem mundane on the giant screen. So you're trying to find those, unique story moments that, mesh with high impact, wow moments and visuals. I think having worked in television and feature films and documentary and for those mediums and also for giant screen, every format has its own sort of syntax and language that you have to learn, and sometimes it takes some time and trial and error to do that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the evolution on the Cuba story?
Yeah, first took a trip to Cuba last January, and toured the entire island for a month, just soaking it all in. Basically, it was a research trip primarily, and about halfway through is when I really decided that this could make an interesting giant screen film, because there's so much interesting landscape and people and culture, and so came back from that trip and started doing more research online and stuff that had already been previously made in terms of documentaries and books, and tried to find interesting subjects and stories that might work in giant screen. So from there, I realized that it was such a vast subject, probably too vast to cover properly in this format. So we expanded our ambitions into developing a TV series as well. So we, started developing the TV and the giant screen concurrently from there. And then it was a long process, which I can get into later, going from that initial sort of research gathering to the script that we have now. It's been many iterations and changes in direction, influenced by, subsequent trips and further research and bringing on great writers like Mose Richard.
Great. Now, early in Steve Judson's career, he worked on 2 films for Roger Corman. There are some people who know Roger Corman. Student Nurses and Velvet Vampire. Now, for those of you that need a little education on Velvet Vampire, it was also known as Cemetery Girls. Now, I thought that I might ask him about the differences of working for Greg MacGillivray and Roger Corman, aside from the size of budget. But I decided, I thought I was going to save that for the bar. There is none? Okay. But we can discuss that at further length a little bit later on. I was informed, by the way, by Wikipedia that Student Nurses is now a cult classic. So see it or, lose out on that one. MacGillivray Freeman Films is known for having multiple screenings of rough cuts as they develop their films, with test screenings with public audiences as well as their theater partners. Now, I understand that there were over 100 cuts, Steve, of National Parks Adventure 3D. And this was also a challenging film because there's over 400 national parks. And you had to craft a story around basically awesome images. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of crafting the story and how it evolved after the screenings? And how many of these test screenings did you have?
Well, I thought you were going to ask me generally about the test screenings. So I can't pass up telling a story that I resurrected from my deep memory. Back in the 90s, we love to have test screenings of all the movies to kind of find out what have we left out. In the course of making a movie, you start making assumptions and you think, oh, this is clear. And it used to be clear 4 cuts ago because you had certain lines of narration, and then you cut the narration out, and now it's unclear. So we do test screenings partly for that reason. And we had a movie that had a sequence on dolphins and a very kind of dry CG sequence about Mars. And we had a focus group of 5 and 7-year-old kids, and we asked them, well, which do you like better, the dry CG sequence or the dolphins? The dolphins that look at TV and pick out the right letters on the TV. We obviously assumed that they would like the dolphins, and they said, no, actually our favorite is the sequence on Mars. Every kid said this, and we said, well, why? And they said, well, because of the pancake domes. On Mars, there are these geological formations that are known as pancake domes, and to these kids, this was like an endless supply of pancakes. So you can never kind of second guess your audience. You never know where they're going to be coming from. But anyway, national parks, okay, we've done different kinds of movies. We've done actually we've done wildlife movies like To the Arctic and Humpback Whales. We've done movies that are linear and journeys like Everest and Mysteries of the Nile and Amazing Caves and Coral Reef Adventure. We've done a number of movies that are kind of unstructured in a certain way, where the scenes come in and they can kind of go anywhere, and that would be like The Living Sea or Wild California or national parks. And so there was finding the actual structure for the movie was not easy, and we experimented with lots of different ways of doing it, and it's partly we had a team of much actually smarter and younger editors on the project. And one of them is sitting right there. I wonder if you'd mind standing up and embarrassing yourself. JP, Jason Paul, is one of the editors on the show. And part of it was a more collaborative process. When I'm just editing by myself, it tends to be like it's me in a dark room, and then Greg comes in, tells me what I did wrong. Here it was much more of a collaborative kind of thing, and we made a deliberate attempt to let the younger editors be more experimental than I tend to be. I tend to try to lock into a structure, story structure, as early in the process as I can, and they didn't really want to do that, and we let them experiment more than I probably would have, and I think the movie is better because of that. But the number of test screenings, I can't recall that. I actually came ready with props from the, this is questionnaires from the theaters. The theaters always get questionnaires at a rough cut stage. And it's, we learn all kinds of things. Sometimes you learn something specific that people think that, here's a comment from Paul Wilde saying, well, you have a wonderful shot in the beginning of Humpback Whales of the whale turning over. You don't need to repeat that in the end sequence. And, he was absolutely right. I was trying to sort of milk it. And you just get little specific things like that, or you also get comments of, overall, you don't need to be preachy in this movie. The visuals are telling us a lot. You don't need to be preachy. Well, that doesn't direct us to a certain scene, but it does it just plants a seed in your mind. Or a comment saying that what the scientists are doing is interesting, but the scientists themselves are less interesting. And that's one of the big differences between the giant screen format, typically, and there's exceptions to that, but typically the characters are kind of there just to guide you through a series of scenes, and you don't really need to get to know the characters that well. So that's an example of the kind of things we learn from the from the screenings that the questionnaires and the screenings that we hold.
Great, and I didn't mean to limit you by just national parks. If there's other examples you want to share, that's fine.
Oh, I could go on.
Okay, well, maybe we'll save them for a little bit later. Are there any questions from the audience about this process? And how many screenings do you generally do, and what are the audiences you do them?
Well, we have different types of audiences. One audience is Greg and Barbara's friends from Laguna. And that's one level, and then we have other screenings where we invite a whole cross-section of people so that we get a more varied kind of feedback. And, in some films we've just done like 3 screenings, and some films we've done 8 or 9 screenings. So it's varied a lot.
And which film, Steve, would you say was most changed, a film that you worked on that was most changed by these audience screenings?
Well, of course, famously, Dolphins was radically changed when it was screened at the GSCA. And it was a highly anticipated film, and it met with a lot of objection to the fact that it was too narrow in scope, and people were expecting to see more dolphins. And so Greg and the crew just basically, we didn't see them for a couple of months. They just went all over and captured all kinds of shots of dolphins, which radically altered the movie. And so I think there's never been a film that was more influenced than that by feedback.
James Hyder, LF Examiner. So where do you have the screenings? How many, what format do you present them in?
We have the screenings at the theater at our offices in Laguna Beach, which accommodates about 45 or 50 people. And we just screen them digitally nowadays, which is digitally projected, which is a big advantage. It used to be 35 projected, which was, so that's the format. And basically, what we're looking for is patterns. You can't take it literally. People say, oh, I had a problem with this. Well, very often what they had a problem with was the previous sequence. Something got them off guard and put them off. And so all it is a guide to tell you you've got a problem here. But it depends on the people who are looking at it. When we get comments from theaters, they're apt to be more sort of on the money because a lot of you have spent a lot of time doing this. So the criticisms are a little bit more targeted.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll continue. This morning we heard from Valentine Cass from the National Science Foundation, and she clearly stated that the science has to be spot on in these films, again, for the National Science Foundation funding, and that in fact, when they send some peer-reviewed proposals that may have been approved by the theater community, when they're sent to the scientific review, they're often vetoed because the science just isn't accurate, isn't correct. Now, Wendy has been working on Amazon Adventure, and she has assembled over 100 scientific and historical advisors. Yes, that number's correct. It's not a typo, 100. You have actually gone to the British Museum of Natural History and read original documents from the film's hero, Henry Walter Bates, from the 1850s. And I think that your current bibliography for references is about 85 pages. So I'm just wondering, given the weight of all the scientific information and knowledge, how do you keep it from weighing down the story of the film?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that there was no scientists harmed in the making of this script, not one. There were several heated battles, there was some pretty tense moments, but overall, my writing partner comes from dramatic feature filmmaking. And he's interested in science, but part of the reason I chose him is because my job was more to deal with the scientists and to work out the scientific story. And for me, it was both an honor and a privilege to be taking, and very much our theme and our goal was to explain the scientific process and for perhaps the greatest scientific explanation for life on Earth. So that's a bit of a daunting goal. And how do you take that, and how do you put that in a way that our target audience can understand and also be entertained by? So this was our challenge. And also, when you have partners like the National Science Foundation or Tangled Bank Studios, led by Dr. Sean Carroll, who's one of the world's top evolutionary biologists, I felt like I had Darth Vader over my shoulder all the time. And he's also not just that, he's an excellent communicator. And he has been involved in various television shows. He's written 3 best-selling books where he takes complicated science and reduces into something that, the average person can understand. So we technically just had 5 advisors, 4 science advisors and 1 historical advisor. And then that ballooned into something lots of times I didn't even tell Jonathan what it had gone to, like our research team. But in the world of mimicry and natural selection, and also the fact that Bates is unknown, mimicry is relatively unknown, these creatures are hard to find. So therefore, when you have this extraordinary creature, this 4-inch moth caterpillar that has adapted and changed in the rainforest to look like the head of a viper snake. So you have to find the world's leading expert on that particular creature. We have 50 animals in the film. We used to have 60, but Miles and Mike and Jonathan, we've been reduced down to 50. And that may reduce a bit as we're finding certain things in pre-production. So it's really important that you communicate with these world-leading scientists. And of course, they all want you to put more in about their creature. I mean, these are people that have been working in this area for all of their lives. So we have to go out here and read everything, and then come down into the smallest little sound bite that fits into your theme and your storyline and all of that. So that was a very challenging process. And in the beginning, I needed all of them. But now, after having spent over 2 years in this, with the research team and my own growing knowledge, it's more like, here it is, hit me with your best shot, your best question, because we've just learned a tremendous amount of information to the point that we have unearthed, to everyone's surprise, new original information. So once you've established that with the scientists and they feel you really know what you're talking about, and they feel a certain zone of safety in how you're taking this important information with this incredible guy, because he's an incredible guy, then it sort of levels out a bit. One of the things we did, which was really important, is when they felt that perhaps younger audiences would not understand this, the whole process of natural selection, which is really counterintuitive, and mimicry. How did it come to be that one animal that's toxic, another animal has adapted and changed to look just like it, right? So that took a lot of research, and so finally we took the script. We went to grade 9 classes, and we had them read the script. And then we gave them a pretty complicated survey. Some of it multiple choice, some of it they had to draw diagrams, they had to show what they knew before, what they knew after. And it was amazing how much they understood. So I think there was a tendency for some of the scientists to think that younger people wouldn't understand it, but they did. And that was very important in terms of getting credibility as well with the scientists.
Great. Wendy, can you speak a little to some of the research that came out, was published recently, I think just a couple of weeks ago, about students and knowing the story of challenge for successful scientists?
Yes, it's very interesting research, and it's very you know, heartwarming for us, because what it shows is that when kids are trying to learn a certain scientific idea, when they can identify with the scientist, and particularly that scientist's obstacles and perils that they've had to go through, and when it's done in a narrative, a story, so you learn about that scientist. So for example, Einstein or Madame Curie, or in our case, Henry Bates, who went through, I mean, his dramatic arc is phenomenal, and he went through so much that actually we found this when we were testing with the students as well, that they really got into it. And it's the way we did Flight of the Butterflies. Fred was, you know, we showed younger Fred, but he was an older protagonist. In this case, Bates, you know, we'll be following him in the film. We'll have a younger Bates briefly, but we'll be following Bates from about, I guess, 22 to about 36. And so I think that they're going to even identify more with that, because he risked his life for science, and he almost died 3 times. And, you know, he was a nobody, an absolute nobody. And so I think that, you know, we can bring all those elements together in the film, and the response we're getting is proving that to be true.
I have a follow-up on language, and this will be to all 3 panelists. You did your test with 9th graders, and I guess where would you say the language level is pitched when this film or Flight of the Butterflies? Is it to a particular grade level, or do you actually test as you did this one? This you were more for content, but when you get to the actual script, how do you do the language positioning with respect to audience?
Well, we did some of that when we did with the, you know, the grade 9s. And I mean, again, I think we're telling the story visually and through the narrative and the sync dialogue in a way that all age groups will get. I think you can't have them all understand every little thing you're saying. So as long as they get the thrust of it, that it whets their appetite to learn more, I mean, that's really what we're going for. So, and I think we've had enough people look at it, and there's so much more testing that's going to have to go on with this. You know, not just the requirements of the National Science Foundation, but for ourselves. Because again, it's a tremendous responsibility, and we know our theme, we've stuck to the theme, and we want as many people to understand it and be entertained by it. And then based on this research, it makes them want to learn more.
Great. Steve, as a writer, where have you pitched the grade level for language on the MacFree films?
3rd grade. We actually do try to have 2 levels going at any one time throughout the script, which is you're talking to the adults, college educated, and you're talking to the school groups that come. And so you have those parallel tracks, and throughout the movie you've got to have some things that the kids can latch onto and grasp and appreciate. And at the same time, you have to have concepts that are intricate enough that you engage the adults. So we try to have it, both going at once. I think rather than pitching the language, I think if you look at our films, the language is pretty simple. we try to express concepts as simply and concisely as we can. And that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that, of course, compared to other formats, we don't have as many words in a 40-minute movie as you do in a TV show. So words are at a premium, and for that reason, too, we try to be concise and let other things take over. Wendy mentioned something very important, which is sync dialogue. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a revolution going on in the kind of opportunities for storytelling in our medium, which is the more we're capturing things in digital, the more you can use sync dialogue, because you can use a lot longer takes. You're not restricted by the 3-minute limitation. Your people in front of the camera are no longer as intimidated by the camera, so that they'll be more natural. And also, of course, the sound quality is so much better with digital capture. I mean, for me, the scene that brought this home was in Born to Be Wild, with the trainers that were dealing with those little babies, baby orangutans. It was a kind of intimacy that had never been captured and put on the giant screen before. And to me, that was a game changer, and it's something that I think we'll all be working more and more with as we go forward.
Steve, for some of our newer members, can you elaborate on the comment you made about the 3-minute limit?
Well, just that when you're capturing in 1570, a 1,000-foot magazine equates to 3 minutes. And so, then you stop and reload. And the comment about the noises of the cameras sound kind of like a tractor. So when we're doing sync dialogue, and they're better than ever at notching out that sound, but you can't get rid of it. And we often try to have something on the set which can mask that. If you're on a boat, if you're in an airplane, if there's something there that can help mask the camera noise, that always helps too.
Great. Peter, do you have anything to add on the thoughts on the language?
Well, in the case of Cuba, our primary first audience was the Cuban government, so we had to write something that would get approved, and they had to, vet the script. So, we, from the start, we consciously set out to make something that, on the surface, is apolitical, and that's the only way to get a project like this approved. So. Decidedly adult, and for communist adults. So that's been challenging.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. This reminds me of another thought, and that is versioning. And perhaps if Wendy and Steve could talk a little bit to the issue of versioning, on how that happens. Do you let the theaters do their own versioning? Do you prepare the versioning? What about any review that has to be done by different governments? How challenging is that aspect, especially since the international releases can be important?
Well, increasingly, the theaters are doing their own versioning. We decades ago tried to keep more control over that, and people have been doing a better and better job, and so that's what we're doing. I think it's obviously the case that the English language can sometimes be more concise, so that people want a verbatim script in foreign lands, and we can give them that, but we can also give them an abbreviated script, which gives them a chance to get to the essence of the idea, but within the time frame that they use. We have to be careful about, we use a lot of idioms in our scripts particularly, and so we often have to translate what we're saying. And there's the other factor, which is there's a real cultural divide between the North American audience and the European audience. Europeans don't necessarily like everything explained. They don't like to be led by the nose as much as North American audiences. So sometimes the Europeans just say, well, we just as soon leave that out, which they're free to do.
I wanted to address the issue of the words and the sync dialogue, and just sort of to lob a comment in, and something that we're doing which is kind of interesting on this particular film versus previous films, is, I mean, I think we all probably agree that a film that is wall-to-wall narration is not very satisfying. So we try and pay really close attention to how much is the least amount of narration we can get away with. And it's quite difficult when you're dealing with a complicated subject matter that you're trying to simplify. So we've really had this challenge on this current film. But one of the things we realized, and we actually literally added up every word that was spoken, whether sync dialogue or narration, in the current script. And then we compared that to previous films, where we just counted all the words. And we thought, okay, so where do we stand in terms of previous scripts? And we're working on the assumption, which I think is correct, but we're going to find out when we release the film, that sync dialogue, it makes sense to me that sync dialogue does nothing like the weighing down of a script like narration does. So we actually, in our current script, have more words than previously, but actually less narration than previously. And so we're going to hope, it'll be interesting, I think, for everyone to sort of think about this as following up on what Steve said, which is very important, which is now there really is much more opportunity for sync dialogue. Whether you're making a film that has actors like we are doing, or whether you're making a film that has on-location sync sound, the same principle applies. If you're watching people who are conversing with each other and are saying things that are engaged and engaging on the screen, that shouldn't weigh anything down. When you're looking at an incredible image and you're hearing somebody drone on endlessly, that's maybe not so good. So I just lob that comment in there for anyone to pick up on. And in terms of versioning, it is, it's something that we obviously have to pay a lot of attention to, because a great deal of revenue is earned, even though more than 50% generally in the English language, but there's still a lot of revenue out there for non-English language. And so, for instance, on Flight of the Butterflies, there's the end credits, and it says, it says some very simple things. Fred and Nora Urquhart were awarded the Order of Canada for one of the greatest contributions to natural history in Canadian history. And when you say that in some other languages, and it's only on screen for X number of seconds, and I've listened to some of the other versions, and it's hilarious. They just like race through it. It absolutely kills it kills it to me listening to it. So it really would urge you to pay attention to that, to remember that and as Steve has rightly, and obviously they do pay attention to that, it really can make it more difficult in other languages. You have to give them a roadmap to make the foreign language versions work, because it's so important in our business.
Thank you to Jonathan Barker from SK Films
Oh,
for the
sorry.
info. And if there's more questions,
Oh, Bob had an insult, I think. What was it? Oh, yeah. It was, have you had a good day, Bob?
yeah. Bob, I did at the beginning of the session indicate it was to be a conversation. So lobs like Jonathan's are very welcome. Any other contributions? So please.
I'm always tempted to say, how far from Winnipeg to Montreal? From 39 steps. But anyway, to Stephen, could you comment on your use of, which I think is quite remarkable, of music to drive the plot and to form the emotional heart of the film?
Well, yeah, basically, I work a little differently. Let's say take a wonderful writer like Mose Richard. He's working as a writer, and I'm a writer-editor, and the process is very different. And the advantage that Mose has is that he can retain his objectivity in a way that I really can't while I'm in the weeds day after day. The advantage that I have is that I can change everything at once. The music, the picture, the words, any one of those can change at any moment, so there's like no waiting, so to speak. I can just change it. The process with the music, I do try to sort of therefore weave them all together, and if the words are getting in the way of making the music work in a certain scene, well then I shorten the words. And the other key part of your question is the emotional content, because you know, these films only work to the extent that we can engage people. There has to be emotion and emotional content that, that the audience can hook into. And if the movie doesn't have that, then it doesn't have the thing that people are coming to see more than, to experience more than anything. They're there to experience the images, but there has to be an emotional content behind it. And often we use music to do that, because it's tough when so much of our characterization is coming through voiceover and narration. It's more difficult to get convincing acting and such with voiceover. And so frequent for that reason, the music is a more efficient tool for us, a more effective tool.
Wendy, would you like to comment on music?
Because of the genre that we're sort of working in, which is roughly 50% natural history, and then 50% the drama, and in this case, a discovery by, you know, a great scientist, then, you know, we need a composer. Because for myself, and it could be an indication of my age, I don't like it when the tail wags the dog. I don't like it when it's takes us away from the story. It should be enhancing the story. So, and I think it's something that, you know, is really important to us, because we are trying to bring out emotion and peril and frustration in the scientific process and the human being behind this. And so the music plays a very important point. I mean, there's always times where there's a moment and the music can go up. But as long as that music goes with the theme and goes with your storyline and the threads that you're weaving through the story, and it almost becomes seamless so that the audience really isn't, they're just into it, you know. It's a difficult thing to achieve, and it's something that, you know, Jonathan is it's an instrumental part of what we do. So that's my basic comment.
Wendy, when you hire a composer for a specific project, when do they come in to play, pardon the pun? How early on the process? How much time is allocated for that aspect? And then for the melding of narration and sync sound and music?
Well, I guess, Jonathan, we would say as early as we possibly can. I mean, do you want to add to that?
You want me to comment on that?
Yeah.
It's, I mean, it depends in part on the project. So for instance, in this current film, we're bringing the composer on now because actually our hero sings and plays guitar in the film. And we need what he does on set to, you know, we need the music to be effectively, the sort of tone of the music to be set, because actually that music is going to be embedded into the shooting of the film. So that's not normal in this format, usually. So, you know, our normal pattern would be to bring the composer on when, you know, at least, you know, when you've got a cut, then your composer starts to compose to that cut, because of course there's no point in he or she composing music for something that isn't in the film anymore. So generally, you know, you bring him or her on when it's cut, and then it's often a fairly limited time frame. But I don't know whether that's what others, you know, whether that's what you guys do, but go ahead and comment.
Yeah, and very important part of Bates's character is, you know, he was a polymath, he was self-taught, and he loved music. And, you know, he was a very fun-loving, funny guy, but he carried around a guitar and a red-faced monkey, and loved the native community, loved Portuguese folk songs, loved native songs, loved their instruments, bought different instruments. So it was with him all the time. And at one point he lost one and he was robbed of another. It was very difficult for him. So we're trying to get this left brain, right brain, and we're trying to use the music as a tool for the discovery, as he's trying to, like a great detective, figure out the little, you know, parts of what's working in mimicry and not, and what does it all mean. So it's going to be very important in the film, actually.
You know, music's a huge part of Cuba, of their culture, and so it's a major component in this film. And, you know, I think we're probably going to use a combination of existing Cuban music, because there's so much amazing Cuban music already there, much of which, you know, most of us Americans can barely fathom, and some orchestral score as well, just to, you know, interweave it. One of our stories, one of our main cultural stories, is about a young ballet student. So there's, you know, classical music there, but they also have some Cuban influence in their dancing there. So you know, for the sizzle reel, we actually listened to literally thousands of Cuban tracks, and you know, just finding the right rhythm and emotion to go with your imagery is a huge challenge, as I'm sure, you know, other filmmakers in this room know.
Well, I just want to say I really like the music in the clip you showed. I think I heard the Buena Vista Social Club in there.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to have, that's going to be a wonderful part of the movie. Is the music from Cuba is wonderful. Just what we do is actually Steve Wood has done virtually all our films as composer. He starts doing sketches very early on before we even have a cut, and he'll work on themes, and he'll just do stuff, and it doesn't have a place, and he's just going for, here's a feeling, here's another feeling. He's got 2 or 3 themes going, and then he just starts feeding them to me and JP and Mark Fletcher, the other editor. And we just start working with him, and you just start, well, this kind of goes with this scene, and then he'll say, well, yeah, but if it's with that scene, then we should add merengues or whatever. And so it's actually an evolutionary process that goes on quite early in the cut, but it gives us something to cut to early in the process.
One thing I'll just mention generally, and if there's anyone here who has the technical expertise to speak to it a little bit more, is that with DCPs for the IMAX laser systems now, there is the 12.1 channel configuration, and my understanding is you have to plan for that in advance, design your sound to go with that particular immersive environment, and then obviously take care of special recording details to make sure that the files are in the proper order they need to be. I have about that much information on this. I recently worked on a 1 minute and 25-second spot for our theater, and I have to say that I respect even more everything that the filmmakers do. I think it's a miracle the films ever get on screen after my 1 minute and 25-second experience. And I must say the music was the most challenging portion, even for something that tiny. And tomorrow morning, I think we're playing that spot. In September, I will have the second spot because we had to have 2 versions because of differences of musical opinion among 2 key stakeholders at the Science Center. So we will have the symphonic version tomorrow morning, and in September we'll have one that has the Seattle rock beat to it. For those of you that are music fans, something a la Death Cab for Cutie. Anyway, that's for September. And there was a question over here at the microphone. Maybe he gave up. Oh, he went away, sorry. Any other questions on music or the process of music for the panel? I guess I had a question on how you determine whether you want a male or female voice on your narration. Who wants to take it first?
Well, for Amazon Adventure, I think it's a relatively easy decision because there's 2 brief glimpses of women in the film, and so we really feel that the bookending of the narration should be done by a female, almost like the voice of Mother Earth. So, because we're bringing you into this enchanted place, because the rainforest itself is a character, and so we've made the decision that it would be a female. But I guess it's going to depend on, you know, each film.
Steve? Male or female voice?
For us, it's just a question of whether Meryl Streep is available or not. A lot of times when you're listening, if you've got, we use quite a bit of voiceover in the films, and so if you've got two male characters predominantly doing the voiceover, you're better off to have a female narrator and vice versa. So that's a big factor, and it depends on who it is. I mean, with Dolphins, when we found out it's Pierce Brosnan, well, Tim Cahill and I started trying to weave in a few little lines that, he has that kind of snide sense of humor, and we were trying to write to that. With To the Arctic, I had a line which I'd written earlier on, which was, it's something like, it's a cold place, but to a polar bear, it's paradise. Well, it's just kind of a little bit cheesy. And so it's one of those lines that's right on the edge. And so I tried it, and then we pulled it out. And then when we found out that, okay, Meryl Streep's on board, we put it back in the script. And as soon as we heard her say it, we knew, yeah, absolutely. Because there are certain narrators that have a gift, and they can deliver a line that's basically kind of a little bit dumb and a little bit cheesy, and they can make it sound smart and make it sound playful, which is what we wanted as something for the kids, And with Ewan McGregor, we had a problem at the beginning because Greg really wanted the idea of the parallel universe. That was his idea that he wanted to start out the Humpback Whale film with, the idea of the parallel universe. And we had certain people who were objecting to it because, of course, there's a branch of physics that's quite controversial that espouses the parallel universe. So when I found out it was Ewan McGregor, I just tried this thing with it would change the line to say, there's a kind of parallel universe. And so it takes the edge off, okay, we're not espousing it, it's just a sort of metaphorical thing. But he's the kind of narrator that can pull that off. If you have Patrick Stewart or William Shatner or somebody like that, they can't pull off a line like that. So to some degree, we do actually write to who the actual narrator is.
Peter, what are you thinking about for Cuba?
We haven't decided yet. We have a version of the script where Cuba itself is the narrator, and taking inspiration from Soy Cuba, and if we were to follow that, the female voice would kind of fit nicely. But it kind of goes back to, do you prefer Richard Attenborough or Sigourney Weaver for Planet Earth? There's arguments for both, and our cast of characters are pretty well balanced, so you could really go either way. So ultimately, it's just going to come down to testing it, I think, and seeing how the language flows in combination with the voiceover and dialogue.
Something I've noticed in the films this morning, and also some of the bring back the wide shot films over the years, is just the incredible lyricism of the storytelling in a lot of the older films that seems that there's more sparse narration and more reliance on the image and just a lyrical storytelling style that I feel that really resonates with me, but I feel like it hasn't in more of the recent films is not there as much. And I just wonder if you all could maybe tell why that the industry or the films have evolved over the years towards that, or maybe you disagree with my premises. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, you're more observant than I am. So I haven't really noticed it going away, but I guess I haven't looked at it as an overall pattern to the way the films have developed. I mean, we don't have one certain approach to storytelling, contrary to what people talk about, the MacGillivray Freeman formula. We don't actually, it's not written down anywhere. We don't, but there is a desire to let the images speak for itself. I mean, national parks is just, that's the latest thing that we've done. And I think from our perspective, what we've tried to do is let the images predominate, and the words are there kind of at the service of the images. We're still telling a story. There's the story of Teddy Roosevelt, which is there for emotion, and the same thing with Conrad Anker. But for the most part, the words are there to give meaning to the images and to be, not get in the way of the images, but to be as sparse as we can be. But I don't, because I haven't really recognized the pattern that you're talking about, I can't speak to it.
Yeah, I've been around long enough to know a little bit of what you're talking about, at least in the beginning, as the wife of Jonathan, and just while I was in the feature film world for 15 years, just knowing those films, and Robert Kerr as our partner for a while. So I think whatever, like when you're doing what we're doing, it's, you know, mixing both the natural history story and the drama story. Then you sort of, you overwrite it, and then you've got to underwrite it, and we're trying to pace it. So there's always moments, like in Flight of the Butterflies, I don't know if you've seen that film, but where the movie can breathe, and that it also matches, in this case, when you're doing a hybrid like we are, that you know, it heightens the emotion. So the butterflies became that, certain moments where, you know, we would have liked a bit more, but there was a story to tell. And that's always the struggle we go through. But we do aim for that, as I think most filmmakers really do, because we've got this magical, immersive medium. So just like you want to have a few $1 million shots, and you want to have places where it breathes, but I think when you align that with the with the rhythm of where the emotions, you want the emotions to go, that's when it's just a beautiful moment, in my view anyway. So I think it's what most people are going for. Certainly. Sure, go ahead.
I think, too, on the most basic level, it comes down to the image. When we're working on the films, we rarely see the images in their full glory, the way they're going to be in the movie. And so it's very easy, day after day, you see this thing on a small screen, and it's very easy to think that you have to push this story in a certain way. And I think that the failure to do that sometimes, and the push to overwrite, comes from not respecting the power that that image is going to have, and trusting in the power that that image will have eventually up on the big screen.
And I'll just add a few comments to that. Or you were going to add?
I
Go
was
ahead.
just going to say one thing that, you know, Jonathan says to various scientists and investors that we work with when everybody's happy with the script is we have to give the proviso that once we do all the filming, and certain shots are going to work out better than we thought, and some aren't, and the same thing with the animal behavior or the actors. And so only, as you just said, as you see it, you know, in its glory, then you want to have, you know, your narration match that. So there's at least 20 to 30% of it that then also goes away, and some other things to keep that lyrical thing you're talking about take its place. So that's important too.
And to Richard's point, I sort of concur with that observation. I think that's one reason that the bring back the wide shots element was brought back to this giant screen cinema meetings, and why the Filmmaker Symposium. I think as in any endeavor that, you know, people will try a certain thing, and then they try some new things, and they may forget what did work. And there's also a tendency now with cutting being just so much faster, and people not understanding the impact on the viewers as just mere human beings, on how much they can take in. You can only take in so much, and if you really want to have them enjoy the image as a whole, that's why I think it is driven by the visuals, and why you can't have too much narration, or you can have it, but people aren't going to listen to it. So I think Wendy's word of having the film breathe is a good one. And I remember one of my favorite films is Beavers, and I believe it's about, you know, 33, 35 minutes long, and it only has 8 minutes of narration. There is a little bit of sync sound with the beavers chattering away, but it was very pleasant, and you felt like you were there in nature being the observer, and so it wasn't, the narration wasn't intrusive. And so I think it'll be good to continue this, this conversation, but we have a question.
Yeah.
Let me just add, you know, in working with Mose Richards, and going back to what you were saying about versioning, you know, we have these detailed treatments and scripts, you know, written for certain audiences in the beginning, for, you know, museums or distributors or government officials, and you know, you have to balance, you know, everyone's sort of needs. And as you refine the script and you know, turn it into a film, a lot of that falls away. And working with Mose, he knows this, and oftentimes he'll, you know, I'm sure it's painful for him, but he'll turn in a draft and say, I'm sure you're going to throw most of this out, all of this, you know, narration that he's spent days cranking on. But you know, that's just the process of making the film, and until you actually see the images, like Wendy is saying, you know, you can't know. But at the same time, you still need those words on the page to stimulate readers. So you have, you know, you're basically making the film to be read, and then you make it again to be seen. So.
Next one. Yes.
Yeah, Pete Routier. Very simple question. I just wanted to get your perspective, besides the marketing aspect of getting an A-list celebrity that's typically on screen as your off-voice narration versus a professional voiceover actor who only does off-screen. So besides the marketing value, what is your perspective? Why do you go for an A-list actor instead of a more conventional voiceover?
Well, part of it is, as you say, the expectation nowadays that there will be a name narrator. So that's a part of it. But another part is that some talented actors like Liam Neeson or Meryl Streep can bring something to that narration that a regular voiceover talent, the A-list voiceover talent, can't bring. There's a level of emotion that they can't bring to it. And that's an indefinable thing, but it's an important thing in developing an emotional arc to the movie. And it makes a huge difference. I mean, if you take Robert Redford's voice for the national parks, when you hear that voice, he somehow puts you in the great Western landscape. There's something about that voice, and so there's that advantage to it too, the familiarity and the associations.
I just want to go right back to the lyrical thing. In defense of the example I brought up of South Pacific, about 2/3 of the way through the show, there's like a 1-minute break or so where the camera's just resting against the reef, looking up at it, and the water's just wafting by, and it's just music. And it's such a wonderful relief in that movie that sort of separates, I think it separates the second and third act probably. And it's so lyrical. And that's why I actually came up and started talking about it originally. So when you were saying what happened to the lyricism, I was thinking of that lyricism was so important.
I think one other element that has disappeared for a while is coming back. And again, is I think people get tired of doing the same thing over and over again. For those of us that have been in the industry a while, I think can remember the day where every film had to fly over a cliff. Because you had to have, I see some nods, heads shaking, because you had to make the audience have that visceral sensation of going over the cliff. Well, I think we probably got tired of it. The filmmakers probably got tired of it. I'm not sure the audiences got tired of it. And so when we're trying to bring experiences to the screen that can't be replicated at home, you know, that's one of those very visceral elements. But again, people want to try different things, but it's going back and looking at the language that really has worked and been, you know, effective. So any other comments or questions from the floor right now?
As a filmmaker of giant full dome projects, I want to go back to something that Peter said, because it's really kind of central to how I like to approach filmmaking as well, where sometimes in the process you're writing it to be read and then you're designing the film to be seen. I see it as a process of discovery where at the beginning you only know so much, and you have some thoughts and some ideas that you put out on a page, and then as dailies start coming in, or narration starts getting a voice and other things like that, it's that adaptability to take those resources that you have and continue to sculpt them into a finished product. And I tend to be wanting to check something off my list, and it's like, okay, I don't want to work on that anymore. I'm sick of that. But you always have to keep your adaptability going and look at it from an audience perspective. And sometimes you lose that. You have to bring others in to help you see that, like some of the screenings you're describing, Stephen, and just having that freshness so that it actually comes to life and you see it new as new things are added to it. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that. If you
Yeah,
agree
you know,
or-
as some of you might know, Cubans are kings of improvisation, you know, making do with what they have, and I mean, they're keeping these old cars running on washing machine parts and tractors, and it's, you know, it's beautiful to see, and, you know, making a film there's not so different. So, you know, you go there with a script from Mose Richards, which, you know, is thoroughly researched, and he's got a great imagination, and then reality comes, and you have to reshape the script. You have to, you know, kind of improvise along the way, but, you know, you have to have this sort of structure in place for the production. And, you know, once there's just no substitute for being there and meeting your characters and seeing the places, and then working through these spaces with your cinematography team. So, and then, you know, I think again, like, there's a huge gap between seeing it on a small monitor as you're shooting it, or even in like a semi-large screen as you're editing and finishing it, to actually seeing it on a giant screen or a dome setup, which is very different from a flat screen. So it's this, you know, process of discovery, like you said, and sometimes positive and sometimes negative. So.
Question about narrators. Do you ever use narrators whose first language isn't English? Most of the giant screen films I've seen have American or British narrators. And when you're doing something in the Amazon or in Cuba, you might be tempted to use somebody from there who speaks English well but has an accent. Do you consider that, or is the possibility that people won't be able to make out the accent make that not something you would consider?
Well, I can't think of a case where the primary narrator had an accent. We've certainly had voiceover talent that when we're filming in different countries, we go out of our way. I mean, Humpback Whales, we have Ali, who has an accent. Journey in the South Pacific, you've got all the characters basically were the voiceover are people who are understandable, and their English is clear enough, but they all have accents. And none of those are the real people in New Guinea who can't speak a word of English. Those are all people that we had to cast. And in one case, we actually went for, in the case of Jawi, we had another young man who, you know, 14-year-old boy in Jakarta, and because we were doing all this over Skype, and so we have to get up at like 3 in the morning because Skype kind of crashes in Jakarta by the time business opens. So anyway, we had the two, and we chose the one who had the thicker accent, and we did a whole mix with that, using that boy, and decided, played the other kid and said, no, we better go with the kid who has the less accent, because he was just more accessible for he still has a little accent, but he's more accessible for our audience. So that's the long answer for, yeah, we do sometimes think that the accents can enhance it.
Yeah, it's the same for us. And in Flight of the Butterflies, we had Selma Hayek lined up to do it, and for some strange reason, she chose an Adam Sandler movie instead of Flight of the Butterflies. But again, I think it's a combination of things, of how many other voices you have in the film. You don't want the voices competing. And, you know, and then there's certain vagaries of co-production treaties as well. So for us, it was very important in Flight of the Butterflies to have Mexican composers. It will be the same with Amazon Adventure. And so then when you have that and that flair of the indigenous music, then what kind of voice do you want then, for the narrator? So probably for us, the female narrator will be a British voice, because Bates, of course, coming from the UK.
Peter, what are you thinking?
Well, it's a challenge because, I think the logical choice would be to go with a Cuban American who doesn't have anti-Castro politics and speaks fluent English, but that's a tough person to find.
That's funny. That's Cuban Rosalini films. I wonder if we're talking about the specifics of something that's really very, very basic, and it's very unique to this giant screen format, and that is point of view. A film, from moment to moment, has a point of view. It has a point of view of a certain nature, a certain character, but even more basic, it has either a first-person point of view or it has a third-person point of view. These films start, and I'm brought under a very special, I'm brought under a spell. And then things will disrupt that spell when that point of view changes. An example of something I really enjoyed yesterday was Wild Africa. It started off first person. I was experiencing Wild Africa, and I went under its spell, and I never left that spell for its entire length. It was never disrupted by seeing the image of another person, so I felt special, and I was experiencing this firsthand. They could do that with the nature film. There's other films that are much more complex, air and space subjects and so forth, where you're going from first person to third person. Lyrics and music are going to trigger certain cultural notions and familiarity and so forth. How do you manage that? How, especially in a medium that is immersive and is just begging for first person point of view, but in many cases you've got to bring in a third person storyline and so forth, or a scientific cognitive experience. How do you make these choices, and how do you manage them so they don't get so confused? And it would have something to do with the narrator, the gender of the narrator, the character of the narrator, that changes point of view.
Well, actually, Ron Fricke has the right idea. He has no narration whatsoever. So
Yeah.
well, I think that in recent decades, that's actually changed. I think that younger audiences are more attuned to ask the question, okay, who's saying this, and what is the point of view, and what's behind this? I think the older generations of audiences are more accepting of, okay, here's just, it is what it is. But frequently, point of view shots, I think, I don't have a mechanism for dealing with that. We try to have point of view shots be immersive, and if they can have no narration on them, or almost no narration on them, that's better. What we try to do is give them a context. If you're going to give somebody an experience, give them a ride for 40 seconds or a minute and a half, don't just throw them into it, and give them some kind of something to hang on to, some thought, so that they can see it within a certain context, and then make their own, take it from there, and make the experience their own. But that's one of the techniques that we use for trying to deal with that. We also shift tense quite a lot. I don't know if you notice in the movies, but frequently we're in the past tense and we're going along, and then suddenly when something is more immersive starts to happen and things are exciting, we suddenly jump into present tense. And then, okay, now we're explaining what happened, and so it's in past tense again. That's another thing that we do frequently in our movies, and certain narrators don't really like it when they get the copy and it's jumping from past tense to present tense. But it is something that the audiences have never objected to anyway.
Well, in Amazon Adventure, the point of view is definitely from Henry Walter Bates, and we're trying to bring audiences into this enchanted place, the rainforest, where you have to expect the unexpected. So the POV is Bates. What was it like for him as a 23-year-old? He was there for a brief while with his buddy Alfred Wallace, who left, and Bates stayed for another 9 years. So how, when he was in there and he was in strange territory, both in the rainforest, both with peril of what could happen to him, and then with native guides in a native community. How was he looking at these creatures when he found them? What was he thinking? And so that's prevalent throughout the film. So what did, when he made Eureka moments and he's looking at these creatures, we're going to have, the actors will be down on the ground. They'll be right, he'll be right next to many of the creatures. And we're telling his story from his point of view. And he was uncharacteristically open in his adventure book, which outsold Darwin's book, and he got a bigger advance than Darwin got for his book. He was very open about his vulnerabilities, and so we're trying to play off that. And also, again, when there's a moment that's very poignant, that is set in the rhythm of the film, it just speaks to us. That's the time to slow down and just let it happen and give it as much time as possible.
One of the strange things on point of view that occurred with To the Arctic is we have all the shots of the mother bear and the two cubs, which are taken from a ship, which is close by, because, as some of you recall, the mother, for whatever reason, maybe for safety, chose to hang out by the ship for several days with her two cubs. Well, you start looking at these shots and you go, okay, well, what is the point of view here? Who's looking at this? And we actually created a character retroactively, which is the character of the ship becomes the main character, and the voiceover for that scene is from the captain of the ship. Even though he wasn't, they didn't have good IMAX shots of him, we actually created that. In fact, Alan Markowitz, who's sitting right here, created a panel using a video piece that we used to introduce this character, and then you hear his voice through the whole thing. And it gave a different feeling to those shots. It was more satisfying to see those shots knowing what the point of view was.
Yeah, and we're still, as I mentioned before, grappling with the optimal point of view for Cuba. One approach would be to have it all first person with the narration and the voiceover, which would really put you into a sort of subjective reality of Cubans. That approach would be kind of more along the lines of, say, like a Terrence Malick film and Ron Fricke's work, breaking the fourth wall and just really, forcing the audiences to connect. And then, somewhere in between would be, voiceover with the characters and third-person omniscient narrator, traditional.
I just wanted to mention, too, the Van Gogh film, which was very distinctive in our format for being a first person that was a very effective use of the first person point of view all through the movie.
Hi, my name's Leslie Martin, and I come from a more traditional, animation storytelling background where you have a character and a plot, and it's always driven by the story, and the characters are going through this adventure. And a lot of giant screen films have a message that they're trying to impart, as well as possibly having characters or going through the story. And how do you keep that message from coming off too strong and being off-putting to the audience? And it's kind of a series of questions that I have. So how do you keep it from being off-putting? How do you achieve the balance between the message and the story? And do you think that it's better to follow a character through this story or to follow things based off of the message that you're trying to impart?
Well, we've done quite a few environmental films, starting with The Living Sea, Coral Reef Adventure, To the Arctic, certainly one of them, and Grand Canyon Adventure. And it's been sort of an arc where The Living Sea, the environmental movement was just starting out, and Greg basically just had one directive, and that's make people fall in love with the ocean. And he would just keep giving me this same note over and over and over. You know, Tim Cahill and I writing that thing, we were trying to keep that front and center, and you won't find any we weren't laying a guilt trip on anybody in that movie. Coral Reef Adventure, we tried to personalize it and make the reef that was dying as the Brucey's Reef. So there's a certain man whose village reef is dying, and try to get people hooked into it that way. With Grand Canyon Adventure, it was during a time when people had had enough of the soft sell, and we were getting a lot of feedback saying, you need to come right at this and stop, you know, beating around the bush, and let's get right to what these issues are. So we were much more direct in our treatment of the message in that movie, which is a beautiful movie. Some of the European theaters didn't particularly care for how hard the message was. It was too in their face. With To the Arctic, what we found is that the science advisors, who are very passionate, and they want to, as much as anyone, they want to preserve our environment, but they were telling us, be cautious in your message. Do not be you know, pushing this message, because we've already got the people who already believe in climate change. They're already on board. The people we need to convince are the people who the non-believers who don't. And so the only way to get those people is to use a soft sell approach and don't push it on them. So there has been a kind of ebb and flow in our approach and in the advice we've gotten about how to approach the messages of climate change. We always like to try to put it in the context of a character. You know, that's something we've been doing for decades, and we just believe that people can hook into a movie easier. You need to hook people emotionally, and you can do that easier if you have a character.
In Flight of the Butterflies, our advisory group are the top monarch butterfly scientists in the world, and of course have spent their entire careers studying the monarch and wanting to protect the monarch. So we knew at the onset that the monarch butterfly migration was threatened, that the habitat for milkweed was threatened, and because that's their primary food source, and where they lay their eggs, that was very important. And these three scientists lead various organizations, Monarchs in the Classroom, the migration itself, and there was a lot of expectations on us to deal with this. So it took a lot of negotiation and explaining and a lot of testing on our part of where we were going to pick our moments to say what we had to say. So the approach was, if we get the audiences to love the monarch butterfly, or at least to look at the monarch butterfly in a way up close and personal that they had never seen before, then we had the hook we needed to give the message. So if you just plucked out of the script, we placed it very strategically where we gave the message on each of those things, including climate change, which is this horrible combination of these freakish storms that are happening in the sanctuaries. And if you get both the cold and the wet, hundreds of millions of the butterflies will die. So we were actually complimented quite a bit, including by traditional film critics, which is sometimes hard to get to come to the movies, that we weren't heavy-handed, that they felt it. They felt it as part of the rhythm of the whole story. One of our scientists was a little bit disappointed, But when he saw that kids were understanding this and that the ancillary educational programs that were being done in the classroom played off of this, then, sort of came around to that.
I could have one more about humpback whales, where the message is hooked right to the scene. In other words, when we talk about ship strikes, we then immediately talk about, okay, here's a couple of things you can do to ameliorate that situation, which, by the way, is something that one of the theater people in the questionnaires suggested. When we talk about netting, it's directly linked to the scene where the scientists freeze the whale from the netting. And that's really been the more successful case that we've done, is if you can tie it right to the example, then it's less abstract and less intellectual, and it's easier to just relate to.
Peter, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think with this film, we're just trying to capture the essence and the beauty and the spirit of the Cuban people and the landscape, and finding characters that can really show us Cuba through their eyes. Initially, we started with more Cuban American characters, sort of thinking that we could bridge the cultures that way. We had a Cuban American ballerina who was born and grew up in Cuba, came to the States to perform and live, and then she goes back home to Cuba, and that was a great story. But ultimately, we decided it'd be better to tell the story from the Cuban perspective and through those characters. So I think in our case, characters are driving the story, and I don't think there's any strong message. We've consciously tried to avoid anything political, but just showing Americans and the rest of the world a side of Cuba that we haven't seen. So.
That are told like strictly from the story and the message point of view, like you were saying, like you find the characters in the setting and you use them. How do you guys feel about fictional dramatizations on the giant screen to tell a story or to impart a message?
I could start. In the beginning, we actually had extensive historical reenactments and expensive CG sequences, and went pretty far in that direction through many iterations, and then ultimately decided to bring it to the, more to the present and to the future. So we still have historical story, both archaeological and architectural, like looking back, but we're also looking forward and kind of more rooted in the present. So yeah, I guess it's different with every project, but you only have 40 minutes, so and historical reenactments with expensive effects and sets and actors adds up pretty fast, I realized.
Leslie, you were referring to totally fictional stories?
It could be a fictional story to impart a point in like the natural world, like if you were making up a story of a bear family, to like follow these bears and talk about the destruction of their habitat and sort of impart human characteristics onto them in a structured storyline that's not actually necessarily real. Like the Disney Earth ones do this more so, I feel.
Well, for some reason, you're making me think of March of the Penguins, where there were two versions. There was a French version where it was told in voiceover. You had three characters who were quite amusing in French, and then there was the English version, which was Morgan Freeman. Totally different sensibility there. you know, basically there was a long time when, as far as I think you're talking about wildlife films in particular. Is that true or not?
Any films?
Any films. With wildlife films, there has been a sort of loosening up on the part of the scientific community. At least that's my experience, where the fear of anthropomorphism is not as deep as it once was. As far as using historic recreations, the thing to be conscious of is that the giant screen is very unforgiving. It's very unforgiving of performances. So you can have a performance that will look pretty good on your neighborhood theater screen, and when you see it on the giant screen, there's something, you see something in the eyes, because you can see so well. And if there's anything false about the performance, you'll see it. So it is more demanding. That's the one thing that I would caution.
Well, just kind of following up on that, sort of portrayals of like folklores and myth. I feel like I've seen some of that in IMAX films, but just any commentary on those kinds of fictional stories, shall we say?
Well, I think probably that question should best be directed to the theaters, if that's the kind of thing that they feel that their target market would be interested in. Diane, do you have a comment on that about the?
I think based on the audience surveys and our own theater results, those are not the kinds of stories that our audiences are generally interested in. I have some data with me, and I can look that up and be happy to share it with you. Remembering some of the slides that Paul showed, Fraser showed this morning, they really are interested in the nature films, especially ocean-related films, water films, space films, and again, I think it's because of the tradition of where these films or theaters originated within science centers or other cultural institutions. So I think it's probably a harder sell to do some things that are a little different and not based in that tradition. That said, there are some films out there that, you know, have attempted this, but it is difficult to get a really strong foothold in terms of the exhibitors. And again, because some of the others are so consistently produce audience and box office, that it's a much safer route to go than, you know, to be experimental in that way. Now, there have been some films, for example, our theater was the first theater to sign up for, Science Center, to sign up for Rolling Stones at the Max. Now, that was a completely different kind of, you know, experience. We played it in the evenings, and we did develop, you know, audience with it, and some other people tried it. There was the original Titanic film, Titanica, the IMAX film, and it was, the first version was a 90-minute version, and no one wanted to touch it. I mean, they didn't even have to see the film because they didn't want something that was 90 minutes long, because their format was turning on the hour, so they wanted films that were 40 to 43 minutes. So there have been some strictures just from the history. And that'll probably change over time. One way it's changing on the other direction is for shorter films. Some people are doing the 20 and 25 minutes and turning them either on half an hour or 45 minutes. But I think a lot of that, in terms of what the choices have been, both of topic and length, have been from those historical roots. Does anyone else from the theater care to add any comments to that? Disagree violently or radically? Okay. Great. I had a question about humor. It seems to me that there's not much humor in our films. There is occasionally. Is that because you think humor is just very difficult to do on the giant screen and have it work, much like the acting that Steve thought about? Is it that people are afraid of it because it won't translate appropriately? I think the greatest humor, or the largest scenes of humor I've seen, have been in some of the natural history films, where it's the music matching up with the behavior of the animal, and primarily in underwater scenes, where there's a lightness to it because of the music that accompanies the shot. Any comments on humor?
Yes, I'm against it. It's really hard. I mean, you know, I don't know if you all were there when Francois was introducing his movie yesterday, but it was hysterical. And he had little props down there, and there were bananas falling onto the ground and everything. And it was absolutely great. But you couldn't translate that onto a giant screen film. There's something about humor which has to do with the spontaneity of it, and you see the person's mind at work, and that's part of what makes it funny. And so, you know, we've had so many attempts. We try really hard to get humor into our movies. And the time we tried the hardest was with Dolphins, where Greg said, okay, we're going to get Robin Williams to do this. He's going to be our narrator. So I wrote a version of the Dolphin script that was screamingly funny. And we got this comic from Hollywood to come down and actually read these jokes. And we did a test screening which had about 2 laughs. And, you know, everything dies when, you know, it may be funny when we're sitting around the table, but when a movie is not a live performance, and you know, others have tried it in films with narrators. Jim Carrey, was there a funny line in it? It's very hard to get a laugh out of something that's canned in the sense that narration is. But I agree. I mean, frankly, in when we saw Wild Africa yesterday, there's a moment where you're dropping down through the trees, and all of a sudden you're looking at these 2 eyeballs of this fantastic creature right in your face. Well, it's fun, you know, and it's also funny. But I think the kind of thing that works so much for us is fun, and we try to create a sense of fun rather than fall down funny. And you know, and there are times when you can get laughs almost unintentionally, and to the limit. We have a scene, and Jeff Kirsch might remember this. Tony Aniro is our mountain climber who is climbing up this cliff, and he's climbing, it's a sheer cliff, he's soloing, and all of a sudden things go wrong, and he falls all the way down this cliff, and he's caught by his rope, and he's just kind of hanging there. And there's a lot of, you know, when you see it with an audience, there's a lot of tension at that moment. And the first thing he says in voiceover is, "I've always been afraid of heights." Well, it's a sort of thing on the page, it means nothing. And our colleagues from WGBH didn't even want to hear it on a test track. But when they saw it with our test audiences always laugh at that line, and it's partly just because it releases the tension at that moment. But it isn't a line written to be funny. I actually wrote it because it's true, he was afraid of heights when he started climbing. And so I think the lines moments that seem to work best are the ones that sort of come naturally rather than where you're trying to force them.
Well, in the case of our story with Henry Bates, fortunately, he was a really funny guy, prankster, just born a happy-go-lucky, good-natured guy. So, you know, he's alone in the Amazon for many years, so there's a bit of talking to himself and other things. So we'll be able to play on that in the times that he was with Alfred Wallace. I got into a bit of a tiff with the scientist at the Natural History Museum in London, Dr. George Beccaloni, who tried to convince me that Wallace was much funnier than Bates. And that was quite interesting because he definitely wasn't. But so I think there's differences between lighthearted moments and humorous moments. I think it's very hard in this medium to have a lot of that. And sometimes it can even get in the way if the narrator is, you know, a celeb and trying too hard to be funny, as you said. It can work against what you're trying to show in the behavior, and sometimes it inadvertently takes the audience away from the moment that they're having in the natural history. So again, I think it's just sort of a balance. So in this case, we've, at a time when it seems people are asking for more humor, I think we're going to be, in the truthfulness of Bates in the story, be able to show some of that. I
think it's all about the cute furry animals. Like, it's Tiny Giants and Pandemonium and the Prairie Dogs and National Parks Adventure. I think it makes people smile and laugh sometimes, just, instinctually.
Just naturally.
Steve, you mentioned Jim Carrey, and it was quite interesting. We had the privilege of attending a showing of a cut that Tony and Graham had of that film for a few of us in Toronto, with a track that Jim Carrey had done. It wasn't the track you heard in the final film. It was most of it. But what was really interesting about it was that he clearly was improvising at a few points during this, right? And he had some hilarious lines, really hilarious. But what became really clear was you have to make a choice. This is what we all discussed right afterwards, is you're going to have to make a choice here, because wouldn't it be fantastic? Just let Jim Carrey riff over the whole film. Just let her rip, And I think it would have been truly fantastic, but it would have been a Jim Carrey comedy hour of underwater, right? And then that was really, like Wendy was saying, it kind of was going against what, and they really had to actually cut out the humor that he actually brought to it, because it kind of popped out. It was like, what? Oh, I see, it's a Jim Carrey funny movie. No, actually, no, it's a serious, so it's a very hard thing to modulate. And I also think that one of the issues we have is just with culture, and both in age group and in across cultures, because one of the biggest problems we have in making films in this medium is having to be all things to all people effectively. We have to be family audience. So, although it would be great to have, maybe CK do some voiceover for some of these films. Louis CK, I'd love to have that, but, we wouldn't get any leases.
Well, what if you just had it as a separate downloadable audio track and you could just put it on your...
No, that's a very good idea.
Snoop Dogg narrating Planet Earth.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, anyway, it is an issue in terms of, doing versioning and all of that. So I just throw that in. It's a really tough thing to manage across age groups and cultures.
Yeah, 10 comedians narrating your film, and you could get people to come over and over again.
That's called very, very personalized viewing. You can have.
They've done that with some Hollywood films where the directors will do audio commentaries, and you can download it and listen to it in the theater as you're watching the film, which I think it's cool.
Yeah, very personalized. I think to Steve's comment about humorous lines that come up naturally, that they tend to work. I don't know if some of you were able to see the fine cut of A Beautiful Planet. There was a line in there by the astronaut who had to give his fellow astronaut a haircut, and that he said that was the most terrifying part of the whole mission. And James Nyhouse said when he heard that comment come down, it wasn't scripted at all. When he heard that comment, he said, oh, that one's in the film. And the astronaut actually did go to the hair salon with his colleague so that he could see how her hair was cut. So he took some lessons beforehand. So that was spot on there in terms of something natural that was a light moment. I was looking at the data that I referenced earlier, and interest in specific topics in the giant screen, and this is for audiences. These are current giant screen audiences. And as I mentioned earlier, oceans, marine life underwater was the highest rated at 68% of the audiences wanted to see that kind of film. Space was at 67%. If we go down to comedy, it's 30%. So I guess they while people may want a certain lightness in the films, they don't want to see comedy on the giant screen. Interestingly enough, comedy rated 2 percentage points above drama. Drama was at 28%. So I think that was, and detective and mystery tied comedy at 30%. So I think the audiences pretty much that are currently going to theaters, those are the kinds of topics that they are interested in. Well, I think we've heard the definitive comments on humor in terms of the giant screen experience. Are there any other general questions from the floor? I want to make sure I allow enough time for any general questions on any aspect for our panelists. Because if not, I'll go back to some of the other questions that I had. But I want to make sure that people have time to get their questions out. We've been talking around a lot of different topics, some specific, some general. This was a question that someone had given me at one point when I was preparing for the panel, and they asked, how would you categorize the type of story central to the most successful giant screen films? Would have been the story shortcomings of films that have failed, or do most fail on the technical aspect? And you don't have to name names, it can just be general comments.
To me, it's I guess I have a one-word answer for what works, and that's emotion. I think the films that have done the best are the films that have the audience has hooked into emotionally, and there's different ways to do that, but I think that that's the key element. And sure, the reverse is true. The films that have not done well and don't play very well are the films that leave you cold, and they may be good films in many ways well done, but if you don't hook into them emotionally, then I think they're not going to succeed.
I agree, and I think you can get the emotion through visuals and the emotion through story. And sometimes when the industry is accused of being formulaic, I think that's a function of the fact that the industry has been around for a while. And also it's 45 minutes including credits. I yearn for the days of, having 75 or 90 minutes. So you have to stick, and in our case, when it is a hybrid, you're doing so much in the discovery story, so much in the adventure, and so much in mimicry, and bringing people to places they couldn't go to otherwise. And so these are big challenges, and so you have to be inherently formulaic to a degree. But I think it is emotion, and we're competing against a lot of other entertainment options. And so, right down to, with my children, very tiny screens. So we have to give them something. And I think when you can hook them both emotionally through the visuals, taking them to these incredible places, or up front to an elephant's, nose in a way that no one's ever seen before, and then you combine that with the thread of a story, this is it's a good recipe. So I very much agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, those unique perspectives that writ large, I think, for now is specific to this format, but VR is coming soon. So, I think the things that stick with me from all the giant screen films I've seen since I was a little kid are those, I think, unattainable experiences for most human beings, like going to space or, deep into the ocean. And that's why I think those genres are still so popular. But I think there's plenty of unexplored places and experiences out there waiting to be captured and told in compelling stories in this format. So excited to see what the future brings.
There has been again, you've mentioned it twice, the panelists have mentioned it twice, the whole question of formulaic. Wendy, you mentioned you think that term has come around just because the format has been around for such a long time. But let's turn it around. There are a lot of new filmmakers out in the audience. Is there a formula that works? Obviously, it's emotional. I guess there's the emotion. There's using the the screen to its maximum. Any other general comments along that line? Steve brought up formulaic first.
I guess I don't have a formula that works. You know, there's topics that work. Topic is more important in our format than it is in any other. Location is terribly important. I mean, Greg will start out by, location is part of the discussion on the first, you know, half hour of the movie. It's where are we going to take people? So those are things that are more formulaic, that are typical of our format. The location dominates the visual and what the story is, and we often build stories around locations. So I guess if there's a formula, that would be one that has worked pretty well for us.
I think in the end that we have to offer audiences a mix of stories and a mix of visuals. And it seems by not grand design, but the way it's turned out, that usually is the case. And I think that's really important, that there's a variety of subjects. And I've noticed in these surveys over the years that the audience's tastes seem to change a bit, right? And, you know, sometimes we have more space films or maybe more underwater, but in we seem to be sticking with land, which is the most challenging of all. And as long as there's that mix, and as long as there's a tightness to the storytelling, that it's bookended, that is as if, you know, like Princess Bride, it's someone's just sitting there and saying, once upon a time, you know, there was this place called Cuba, or this wonderful thing in the United States of national parks, or there was this little kid that had this dream, or there's this country that, you know, has the most amazing wildlife, or whatever it is, that you really tell that story as tightly and sparsely, but bring the audiences along to both the visual and the storyline and stick to it. Then I think we have something very unique to offer audiences.
I think you have to continually push the filmmaking techniques and projection techniques as far as you can as well, just to stay ahead of the curve, because this format's been, you know, for a while now co-opted into Hollywood blockbuster exhibition. So in some ways, I think a lot of younger audiences are desensitized to the format. You know, I was just in Poland end of last year doing a seminar, and no one in the room had seen a documentary IMAX film, but they'd all seen Hollywood features. So they had no idea what to expect. So I think we have to be able to offer visuals and experiences that are distinguished from, you know, the other content out there. And to do so, we have to continually push those technological boundaries. I know Ang Lee just announced that he's screening a 4K 3D 120 frame per second film at NAB next month. And that, you know, I think that's going to heighten the emotional potential of filmmaking. So all of these things are worth exploring.
First of all, I've never heard Steve Judson talk so much in any passage of time, so congratulations. But I also want to congratulate everybody up there for being so patient with the questions and really sticking to it. This is an incredible meeting for me. But the thing that occurred to me is mistakes, and all the mistakes that have been made. We've really been talking mostly about how do we try to avoid mistakes, but I think we've got so much material. I don't know how many total films, but is there any way that filmmakers can tap into the mistakes that have been made that didn't work? And you know, when you brought up the the climber, Tony Anero, the climber. It was, that scene was so gripping to the audience that unless there was a comic line there, that would have been what I would call a mistake. We would have lost the audience for going to the next, and I don't remember exactly where we went from there, but I thought that was something that without that was such a gripping thing, especially on the dome. It came from the top, and people were like this, and you heard gasping, and then it was the cleverest, it could have been the cleverest line in the film, but it really had a huge impact on the overall impact of the film, which was very positive, but could have been negative with just that small mistake made if we had left that out. So I just wonder if there's a way we can learn from others' mistakes. I guess people don't want to lay credit to, hey, I made that mistake, and here it is. But it would be nice, because the money involved in a market that doesn't have that big payoff type of money, that if we could figure out how to do that, it might be worthwhile.
Great, Jeff. That really great comment. And we'll go to the panel in a few minutes. I know that Daniel Ferguson and Christian Fry have conceived of some sessions like that. It is a challenge usually to have people get up and say, this film concept was a mistake. I lost my shirt on making this movie. Please don't, we'd advise you not to make this movie. So I think that is one of the sessions that they are, trying to get together. I think what you're talking about is something a little bit more nuanced about individual, mistakes or mistakes that could have happened. I love the story about the Pancake Mountains. I think that is a real classic. But do the panelists have any thoughts or comments on mistakes that you've made in your own projects or that you've had to pull back from? I know Steve has mentioned a few. I think we can certainly put that on the list for the future. But any confessions? Mistake confessions?
I've never made any mistakes. Well, every film, when I look at it, is just a series of, mistakes. When it first opens, literally for the first year, I'm going, okay, that was a mistake, that was a mistake, that was a mistake. There's mostly small errors all the way through the film, and then when you get to see it, a couple of years later with some distance, that voice kind of turns off in your head, in my head. But yeah, there's so many little nuanced things there's lines that we should have dropped. We didn't need that. You see the movie and the movie would have been more enjoyable and more immersive without that line. There's lines like that in national parks. There's lines like that in humpback whales that I wish we had just turned them off. A lot of times that's what the sound mix, the final mix is an exercise in, among other things, figuring out which lines we should dump. That every line is in there for a reason and it has a certain value, but sometimes the overall movie is better without it. And so that's one that comes to mind. I mean, there's all kinds of mistakes of using shots that. One thing that's a problem as we make this transition into digital, we use some shots in humpback whales that I wish we hadn't used, that we didn't see them as they were finally going to look on the large screen until it was too late to change them, and they weren't as good as any of the surrounding shots. Had we had more time, we wouldn't have done that, but we didn't have time to change them at that point. So one of the things is in this age of digital capture, it can be a mistake to not give yourself time to make sure you know what every shot looks like before you totally lock picture and throw away the key.
Well, I think that would be an excellent panel of those brave people that want to go forward, but I would like them to include the almost mistakes that you made. And so, I'm guilty of that certainly, but what we try to do is workshop the script, get the feedback, do all that so we avoid the mistakes. Because even with my partner, he errs on the side of the drama, I err on the side of the science, and then we find a happy medium. And so many times I'm, arguing with that mean-spirited producer over there, Jonathan Barker, that if he takes those lines out with Bates, he's going to wreck the whole essence of Bates' discovery and the discovery story. He's accused me of being in love with Bates, which is true. Luckily for him, Bates is dead by 150 years. So, it really is a balancing act. And so it's both mistakes that we all learn from, and Jonathan could speak more about that because he's had a long career in the IMAX medium. But how did that come across? Oh, did I say the wrong thing? But for me, maybe this is a female thing, I like to avoid, avoid the mistakes. So the more testing you do, the more feedback in the content, it helps guide you of what becomes a consensus. When you get consensus on anything, that's when you have to look at it. And then lo and behold, we cut the line, and guess what? We all survived. We didn't need the line. So.
Right.
I was just thinking about the whole issue of, we do get a lot of feedback while we're making the films, and at a certain point, you have to guard against it being a film by committee, and you have to stick with something that you believe in, even as 500 people are telling you that it absolutely sucks. So we had a case of that was in National Park Adventure. A key reason why Greg wanted to use Conrad Anker is because of the backstory, where Alex Lowe died in the crash, and then Conrad married Alex's widow, and they became a family, and it's a positive story. And it has a lot of emotional resonance. Well, at the same time, does it belong in the national parks, and how can you tell that story without it being a little uncomfortable for people? And we tried various ways of saying, and so Alex died, and so then I married his widow, and it was definitely not working. It was beyond bad. And so several of us, like me, said, this is never going to work. Let's just forget this idea. It does not belong in the movie. And so at a certain point, and of course Greg wasn't about to give up on it, and we tried a few more things. And actually, JP got Max in the room where we were doing voiceover and just said, okay, Max, you answer this question. Why is this important? And so Max just told the story of why it was important to him. And he said it was good to have that father figure back in my life. Well, that was the perspective we needed. If you tell it from any other point of view, it feels cheesy in the movie. If you tell it from that perspective, all of a sudden, Max was the only character in the movie who could validate this whole chain of events. And so, and Greg, to his credit, he just wouldn't give up on telling this story. And it enhances the movie. It adds to the emotion of the movie. But it could only be told after we did it, 50 other ways before we arrived at this.
I think that's another example of MacGillivray Freeman getting comments from their exhibitors. Coming from Seattle and having worked with the mountaineering community on the Everest film, I was very aware of the Conrad Anker story, and I knew that our community was very aware of the Conrad Anker story, and to not include it in the film was going to be odd for that community. And so I went back, worked through Mary Jane, and at MacGillivray Freeman said, it just feels odd not having the story in there. Now I know who I was doing battle with, Steve Judson. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if all four of you maybe could talk about, you were talking about the films that are successful have an emotional quality, and Tim, I think you brought up the sort of lyrical, but it seems like there's this ongoing push-pull between the emotional and lyrical and the informational. I'm just wondering if you guys could all talk about how you deal with the fact that these films need to be, well, often they're scientific in nature, and you're trying to be informational and be concrete. How have you struggled with that push-pull between being informational, being concrete, being fulfilling the science content and maintaining an emotional, lyrical side as well?
Well, we do a lot of analysis of the content, and we take out just the sync dialogue, we take out the narration, and see how it holds up on its own. So we have Bates, and we have an older Bates, and so does it work? Where can we cut? We are always looking to cut it down. So we have a certain theme. We're trying to instill in younger audiences a love of science. Science discovery is like a great detective story. And so that can be done in actions. That can be done by an actor saying nothing, just looking at a creature, or the creature behaving in a certain way. So we're always trying to balance it out. But the ultimate goal is to take certain things away whenever we can in this unique hybrid that we're doing, both in the discovery story, the natural history, and the actual scientist, or naturalist. There are techniques you can use, which, believe it or not, many successful feature film writers, they use those same techniques. So,
Steve, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I guess to the Arctic, or humpback whales would be an example where what we tried to do there was to weave the emotion and the information together. In other words, to not present the information that's the driest, that might be the most interesting to the scientists, because as Wendy says, some of these scientists know really a lot about these whales. But to try to choose our own nuggets from that, which have a sort of emotional resonance, and in the case of the whales, to tell the story as the comeback kid story. I mean, we carefully structured the way we let out the information, so that you had a building sense that this was a success story. This was a tremendous recovery on the part of these wonderful animals. And at the same time, it had to be told with the acknowledgement that they're not completely out of the woods and that there's a long way to go, but that it is a success story. And that would be an example of a film where we tried to integrate the scientific information and the emotional content, instead of looking at them as two separate things, to look at them as a one integral thing.
I guess since you said the four of us, I will go ahead and contribute. As an exhibitor, when I talk to new filmmakers, what I try to remind them is it is only 40 minutes. It's not a TV show, and it is not a book. Probably for me as a viewer, probably the films that have disappointed me the most, assuming they have good technical on screen, is that there's just too much talking. People are not going to remember facts and figures and data. But again, getting back to the point of if we can connect emotionally with them, if we can stimulate curiosity, if we can stimulate questions, if we can stimulate wonder, and so that they feel uplifted and entertained. And I think that to me is most important. And the audiences, when asked, 50% of them said that they want films that entertain or as much as they educate, or entertain a little bit more even than they educate. And again, it's that reality check that it is only 40 minutes. And I do want whatever science in there is to be accurate, but also to show them as much of the world as they can, and to really get them engaged. So hopefully then they go and follow up and do a little bit more work, on their own to find out more information. Peter, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely started out with way too much information, enough for, 10-episode TV series, 1 hour. And so condensing all of that down into an emotional, compelling story has been, the challenge of the last year. And, so it's just been a process of kind of stripping and rewriting and pulling it back, and which will continue throughout the making of the film. You know, just kind of like molding. I guess it's maybe a little bit like sculpture, you know, where you're just carving something out of this giant block of raw material. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you're about to quote Michelangelo said that somebody asked him, how do you make those amazing figures out of this block of stone? And he said, oh, the figure's already there in the stone. All I'm doing is taking away the rock that doesn't belong to that figure. And we don't necessarily, as editors, claim to have the talent of Michelangelo, but it is part of the process. It is part of what we're trying to do.
Great.
The only thing I wanted to add was that one of our concerns with Flight of the Butterflies would younger audiences relate to Fred. A lot of it is with Dr. Urquhart in the latter part of his career, and it was a 40-year search. And we were pleasantly surprised at the amount of positive feedback we got from young kids. Okay, they're going to love the butterfly and the adventure and all of that, but that when they were asked what was their favorite part of the movie, they said, oh, when Dr. Fred, or when you know, the scientists found the butterflies after trying so hard, you know, from 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, 10, 11, 12, they really got into his story. So, you know, that to your point of how do you blend it all, and coming back to the fundamentals of emotion that the kids related with themselves, probably trying so much in their own little lives to achieve something, that this guy did not give up and he achieved it. And it's the same sort of thing we're trying to get with Bates.
Well, this is really following up on what you just said. And my question is along the lines of marketing to children. Everyone has really kind of touched on how they were inspired as a kid by a story, and that's led them into what their stories that they like to talk about. And I realize everything is mission-based by necessity, but at the same time, you know, a lot of it stands to reason that it maybe speaks more to an adult level of understanding. Not always the case, because kids love to see, you know, whales and coral reefs, and they relate to all of that, and they remember it and they love it. But at the same time, you know, a 5-year-old will love a dinosaur but not really want to watch Jurassic Park. So when it comes to, you know, you have a lot of children coming to institutions, and there are a lot of ways that you can pull them in. What are your thoughts? And maybe this is maybe this begs some answers from other people as well as on the panel. But when you're marketing to children and trying to get them to have the same awe for all the reasons that you are all storytellers today in this medium, what are your thoughts on the best ways to do that? Well, we're speaking to, you know, filmmakers, and honestly it comes back to what's the content that, you know, an institution might have to work with in the first place, and it starts with the story. And as a filmmaker, there are a lot of stories you can tell, but there are certain demographics that you are clearly going to be marketing to, depending on how you start your story and how you finish it. So my question's more along the lines of those who are marketing directly to a very, very young audience to get them to the point where they want to come back to your museum or your planetarium every year because they're so in love with it. That's why they, you know, go into an industry that's related.
First of all, from my perspective in our theater, I don't try to market to the very, very young. Because the screen size and the sound can be overwhelming. Doesn't matter if the subject matter is fine, those things are just sometimes too scary. So we probably are in our facility on the side of being cautious on the very young. By the very young, I would say under 5. So that we don't really see that, because we do want them to come back. And one time it broke my heart. There was this little girl, and she must have been 3, and there was a trailer, and she came out of the room screaming because, you know, the trailer scared her. Recently, when we had humpback whales, I saw this grandfather and happened to chat with him out in the lobby, and I was a little surprised because he had probably a 3-year-old going to see humpback whales, and I said, well, you know, IMAX's screen is very large, it's very loud, I wouldn't want him to get scared by the movie. He said, oh, no, he's been here and he had been to see some other film. I don't remember which one. So then later on I saw the grandfather with the little boy, and he said, you were right. Those whales were really big, and the noise was just too loud. You know, because when they do the tail slapping, it was just like, it scared the little boy. So we don't try to market to very, very young children. Two, we have tried to bring in, or we have brought in films specifically for younger children, like Watermelon Magic. Also, on the other extreme, though, Tiny Giants, we brought that in. I tested it with our camp groups. It was fine for 7-year-olds and up, but the 5 to 7 found it a little bit scary. So we tend to be very, very conservative on any of the marketing. We do have a lot of family members that join the Science Center, and so that we, you know, try to educate them as well. We also have kids' reviews of films. And we work with a third party, Parent Map or Seattle's Child, and we actually ask families to come in and do the reviews. And those are absolutely charming. One we got on Tiny Giants was by Sophie, a 6-year-old, that said the film was probably too scary for 5 and 6-year-olds, but she would recommend it for older children, like 8 years old and up. So we also get that kind of feedback and try to have that available. And I'd be happy to talk to you. Oh, okay. So how they modify their content? Right. Okay. Right. I'd say the films that we've been talking about, the MacGillivray Freeman ones on humpback whales, the underwater ones, Flight of the Butterflies. There was interesting kids review on that one, that little boys didn't want to go to the movie because they thought of butterflies as being girly. And there was this young man, I think he was 7 years old, and he went and he wrote that he wanted to be a butterfly scientist when, you know, he grew up. So I think most of the library is really very accessible and approachable from the 7-year-olds and up. I think that's why we brought up the question of language earlier, to see where the language, and I think Steve mentioned about having it on 2 tracks. Wendy, did you want to add anything?
I think it's on most filmmakers' minds in terms of content, that is our target market, and if not, then the distributors that work with the filmmakers bring that to the forefront. So you're looking for families and something that's a universal story, both visually and in compelling and entertaining. You know, as a mother, I would take my kids to some of the animated films and commercial films, and I don't know if you've been to some of them lately. Some of them are they're really scary, and some of the language and ideas are very sophisticated, but it's all part of putting a bit of the humor in there that will appeal to adults. But I think if you have a great story, then, and it's about overcoming something or seeing or going to a place that you normally would not go to, then I think if you stay within that parameter, you're going to be safe.
I think I do want to wrap up. I want to come back to Jeff's question about avoiding mistakes, and I think it ties in to your question as well on the films for younger children. And that is, one of the big advantages of this meeting is to have filmmakers talk to the theaters directly. I think you can avoid a lot of mistakes that way, and I think a lot of films have been made, quite frankly, that shouldn't have been made. And if the filmmakers had taken the time to talk to their prospective clients, and I'd ask the theaters to really be honest. Sometimes we're a very polite community, and we're not quite as honest as we should be. The time where we can be brutally honest is before the film is made.
Yeah, there needs to be more behind-the-scenes documentaries like Burden of Dreams, or, you know, Hearts
Yes.
of Darkness, about the making of giant screen films. I think that'd be really educational.
I think that's a great one. I'd like to wrap up with a quote from an article in a teaching publication in a column that was Ask the Cognitive Scientist, and I thank Wendy for sharing this with me. It says, everyone loves a good story. Psychologists have referred to stories as, quote, psychologically privileged, meaning that our minds treat stories differently than other types of material. Maybe it comes from sitting around all those fires and telling stories in ancient times. So let's continue to work to tell great stories on the biggest screens in the world with the highest quality experiences. I thank our panelists today, Steve, Wendy, and Peter, for their generous time and comments.